We've been talking a bit about the science of creativity and the neuroscience of creativity. What is the neuroscience of creativity? How does neuroscience, how do our brains impact our creativity?
Yeah, so creativity is a very interesting thing because it involves a lot of interconnected brain regions. So in creativity, there are sort of three main brain networks that are activated. And what's quite interesting about it is that these are networks that in other activities don't usually couple together. So we have the default mode network, and that's most active when we are doing things like daydreaming or thinking of like past memories, autobiographical memories and reflection. And then you have the executive control network. And that's acting when we are like exerting like a strategy or thinking on doing task-based thinking. And then you've got the salience network. And the salience network is often not spoken about enough, I think, but it's super important because salience is really what in your environment piques your attention and what your brain attaches meaning to. So when these three networks come together, that's what we see when people are being creative.
So when we're being creative, we're trying to create something new. We're activating our ability to think critically. And then what's the default mode network causing us to do?
So the default mode network is active when we are like daydreaming. And it's really important because obviously in creativity, a certain amount of imagination is needed. And so having that ability to have free-flowing access to ideas is really important. Because when we think about creativity, at the crux of it, what it is we're coming up with new and novel ideas and solutions. But there's a part of it that needs to be somewhat surprising or somewhat kind of non-obvious. Because if these ideas were obvious, then we would say they were logical and not necessarily creative. And we call that being able to develop remote associations. So kind of like the bringing together of disparate ideas, which is super important in creativity. And that's why like your environment and the things that you surround yourself with are hugely important to being creative. Because in many ways, it's like your brain is using these ideas, these past experiences, these past learnings to then form new ideas from being creative and new solutions and innovative ideas.
Is this why or does this mean that when people say they're not creative or they struggle with creativity, that it's because one of these three parts of the brain is not able to sync with the other two?
That's interesting. I think what's interesting is that we say like the strength of connectivity between those three regions is predictive of like creative ability. So yeah, I think that would make sense if you say like maybe if you're not as strong in one area. Like I mean, say for example, what we know about people who are like high creative achievers is that the ability to, I don't want to say distracted because that has negative connotations, but really to sort of take in more of your environment when you're coming up with new and novel solutions is really important. Like there's a study that came out in Harvard, and it's quite old now, it's about 20 years old, by Shelley Carson. And it's really interesting because she basically was looking at what is it that like predicts creative achievement. So creative achievement being like, like writing books or performing pieces live, and what are the kind of what are the mental faculties that really help to predict that? And it was really two things, and one of it is IQ, high IQ, but the other is this concept called like attenuated latent inhibition, and I'll just explain what that is because it's a bit of a mouthful. But so inhibition or latent inhibition is the ability to kind of like, say when you're focusing on a task or trying to get something done, you want to be able to screen out your surroundings and exert a certain amount of like strategic control. People who showed high creative achievement and high IQ also had high latent inhibition, so the ability, attenuated latent inhibition. So I mean they weren't like, you could say, as good at screening out things in their surroundings when they're focusing on something, which I think the creativity is incredibly valuable.
So it had worse focus.
Yeah, you could call it like deeply focused distractibility, but like, yeah, sometimes those words can have negative connotations.
Yes.
And I think it shouldn't be negative because like creativity is like one of the most important skills you can have.
It's almost a little bit ADHD.
Well, I mean, you could say,
we see the tendencies, or we see hyperactive or especially attention deficit, again, quote unquote, because I agree, I wouldn't call these negative tendencies, but they have negative connotations sometimes.
Yeah.
we see this more, at least stereotypically, in more creative people.
Yeah, that's true. And it kind of, and it, as you say, because like if creativity is the sort of coupling of like widespread indicator brain regions, your ability to activate and access those, and a certain amount of that is due to like being able to think of like widespread ideas, but that also doesn't always necessarily correlate with like, yeah, that strategic control. Although obviously to be creative, you do need to have like a certain amount of ability to discern like what's relevant, what's not, what's original and what's not. Which is where the executive control network is really valuable in that, because that sort of, but it's valuable for like different kinds of creativity. So you've got like, divergent creativity, which is the ability to come up with new novel ideas, like widespread ideas, and then convergent creativity, which is often referred to as like creative problem solving or coming up with a solution. But you're sort of like, from a pool of ideas, you're literally converging to find the best solution.
Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to the show, or back to the show for those of you who aren't new here. Getting lots of new faces these days, and so I just wanted to take a quick sec to introduce myself. Hey, I'm Seven, and also to give you a quick announcement. As a little bit of background, this show used to be very focused on what it meant to be a leader, but I quickly realized I already had my answer, which is that I believe you already are one. And it's just about becoming more of that person you want to be. So we're talking about the world, self-leadership, personal development, humanity, discovery, self-discovery, and so much more. This is a place where deep conversations happen in a way that helps you become more of that person you want to be. And so if you appreciate that and you want to help us grow, that I know you're tired of people hearing, we've been hearing this for over a decade, like and subscribe and share the episode, and I get it, but look, it is genuinely the biggest and best thing you can do. I don't play ads or any crap like that. I do this and take this time to say thank you because I appreciate you and where this show is going. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Lots of love, and let's get on with the episode. If I wanted to build up my ability to use these three areas of my brain, now I'm thinking if I have the right bedrock, I can become more creative. And if the bedrock, if the foundation is these three parts of the brain, the default mode network, the executive control system, and the salience network, if I've got those right, that's me having written them down for once. What are some practical things I can do to build up each of these three areas of the brain, or my ability to use the superpowers of these three areas of the brain?
Well, the first thing I would say is open yourself up to new experiences. Like go to, try and go to new places or travel as much as you can, visit art galleries, and open yourself to people's perspectives that you might not heard. Be open to having your views being changed or overturned.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah,
In this time of like polarization
Yeah.
and echo chambers on social media, what you're saying is that actually to improve our creativity, we need to be more nuanced. We need to open ourselves up more.
Yeah, I think so. And being curious, because that's kind of the crux of creativity. Like, obviously there are areas in life you need to be able to judge and discern, have critical thinking, which is really valuable. But when you're learning about like other people's perspectives that are different than your own, it's really important to just have that sense of openness. Because also one of the personality traits that like correlates really highly with creativity is openness to experience. So people who are like, yeah, I'm more open to learning about things, to experiencing new things, and to learning from from people that they haven't, or whose views they don't necessarily share. So that's really important. And curiosity, funnily enough, is like the trait curiosity has been shown to be fairly neuroprotective against Alzheimer's. Well, I won't say neuroprotective. It's people who have show high trait curiosity later in life tend to have better memory.
Okay.
Which is interesting because and I guess it relates to your ability to kind of take in more of your surroundings and not kind of blinker yourself, rather than in that sort of creative ability.
So this helps us build up the default mode network, this creativity, this openness, this curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think.
Okay. Well, so what about the second one then? What about the executive control system? What helps us with that?
Well, I mean, That's really active when we think of like strategic task-based like thinking. And that's useful in creativity for like, as I mentioned, discerning, like when an idea is really novel, when it's relevant. So if you think about that, brain region is really important for things like convergent creativity when you're finding solutions. Because like, yeah, if you're finding a solution to a problem, like say you're like a scientist, like an engineer, it's got to be, you're working within like certain parameters, which is different to that divergent creativity, where you might still be doing that, but there's a bit more sort of free flowing of ideas. So being able to exercise executive control. So like things like critical thinking abilities are super important for that.
One of my recent guests gave us a task of every day making a list of new ideas.
Okay.
And so he'd go, every day, your job at any point of the day is to come up with 10 new ideas about anything, especially if you feel like you lack creativity. And so, on your first day, you might go, I don't know, a new idea for what? I don't know what about. And it takes you like an hour to come up with a list of 10 things. And after 3 months, it takes you 30 seconds. New idea, new idea. And it just goes, it just flows. And then you move on, you forget about it. It's just for the sake of making your brain come up with new ideas. And this sounds like a task-based way of, or almost like tasking things down. Like some of us just go to work and we do whatever is in our calendar, and our calendar is in control, and we didn't actively set our calendar. And it sounds like this isn't very good for this executive control system part of the brain.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it depends on the type of, as I mentioned, the type of creativity, because if it is ideas you're coming up with, then yeah, like the ability to generate, and it's often the first few ideas you come up with don't always tend to be the most creative. It's often the more you sort of really work at it, because that develops those associations. So yeah, I think that's super important. But I think if you're doing something like learning an instrument or learning a language, that involves different types of creativity, where like where being more like actively engaged in movement is really important. Or yeah,
Okay.
that too.
So I need to get better at being a strategic thinker. And then the salience network. This is a part of the brain I actually hadn't heard of before. So tell us more about this and what we can do to help or improve this part of the brain.
Salience is super important because it's essentially what your brain attaches meaning to. So if you think about it, when we go about the world, we really take in not a huge amount of what's available to us in our like perceptual field.
Right,
Like,
very overwhelming.
yeah, it would be too much. Like we're like, and what we pay attention to is really often determined by your past experiences, your interests, and how that shaped your kind of the predictions that your brain is making. And salience is super important because, especially in like, say, for example, I don't know, for a company, if you're doing marketing or anything, like you want to be able to pique people's attention. And when we think about how we go about, well, it's quite interesting because I think often people think that we go about the world like with like senses and the brain, and these experiences imprint on us, and that's how we live. But in reality, your lived experience is very much made up of two things. It's the kind of past learnings and experiences, as I mentioned, things you've learned from your parents, from your social and cultural upbringing, and how those feel and kind of set a sort of like a backdrop for the predictions that your brain is making and how it's helping you to create expectations around reality. So it's those past learnings and the sensory inputs that you're receiving from your environment that really amalgamates you to your experience. But salience is what piques your attention and what kind of, as I mentioned, I've said before, but it's what your brain attaches meaning to. And in creativity, creativity, I think the reason why salience is super important in creativity is because you're being introduced to new and novel things. And when your brain is introduced to something new, it often attaches more meaning because there's more it needs to predict in the environment. So say you're like, going to work every day and you go on the tube, you go to your office. It's a very normal and familiar environment. But say you're like you're traveling, like you're going on a holiday, and you're like navigating a new city. There's obviously going to be so much more that your brain is having to navigate, and that's more costly. But it's also kind of like it attaches more meaning to that because it's kind of like it's creating these defaults that you're like setting, like is like allowing you to predict, in the future. So if that makes sense. That was a bit of a complex.
It does. It feels like there's a way here to almost reverse engineer creativity's building blocks and build up a methodology almost for becoming or being more creative. If someone wants to improve creativity, which I think in the time of AI is actually really interesting, then we want to work on our ability to practically and logically use these areas of the brain that we don't always associate with practical and logical. We associate it with emotional or with, you've got the talent all of a sudden, but actually we're all creators. That's a skill, that's a particularly important part of being human, which means we all have creative ability within us, but maybe some of us don't work on these three areas, or the ability for these three areas to communicate with each other in the brain. Is that a part of this too?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, there's a certain irony in it, is that in wanting to be more creative, exercising strategy over becoming more creative is like, okay, I mean, it works for things like creative problem solving, so that was brilliant, but like when you're trying to come up with new novel ideas, the whole idea is that there aren't guardrails on what it is that you're trying to do. Yes. And in many ways, the more remote, as a sense, the more you're able to think outside the box, then the more kind of creative the ideas will be. But yeah, I think in the age of AI, it's sort of like creativity is really important, and I think AI is I think it can benefit creativity in some ways and then like inhibit it in others. Mm-hmm. So you mentioned about like having these, like being able to engage the interconnected brain regions. Part of doing that is like really putting in effort. But when we use things like LLMs, like ChatGPT, it's brilliant for coming up with new ideas and like brilliant for like, creating these associations and having like a huge diverse span of ideas. But if you're like outsourcing that, then they might not be as hardwired because you're not doing it yourself. You're not putting in the effort. And we know that like it's often that the harder something can be to learn, the more it sticks with in your brain. Yeah, I mean, I think about like in my institute, like I play guitar and I played since I was like 8. And, but like there are some songs that I learned when I was like 14, 15, but the ones I remember I still play now every day are ones that took me like months to learn and have these really like complex riffs, but because it's just more hardwired. And it's not so the other songs are like, they were great, but they were just a bit like, it's just these things that can help you to like really, that mean that your brain is like super engaged. You're engaging interconnected brain regions. And in the world of AI, that can be impaired. I mean, like have you seen the recent MIT study that came out on the effect of using large language models on the brain and the ability to retain knowledge? And they had 3 groups. They had the brain-only group, and they had people over the course of 4 months do a series of exercises. They had a brain-only group, a search engine group, so people used a traditional search engine, like we've been doing for the past 20 years, how long? And then they had the LLM group, so people using ChatGPT. And what they found is that the brain-only group showed the most connectivity between different brain regions. And so if we think about creativity, and that's what's needed for that, then yeah, I mean, it can definitely, I think, using ChatGPT and stuff, it can impair your ability to retain knowledge, and mainly because of that hard wiring. And what they found was that the people who used ChatGPT weren't at the end as good at talking about the things that they had to produce, which kind of makes sense, no? Because like if you're, it's that real like sustenance, like the ability to like retain that knowledge that's really important.
There's a concern that I have that we're going to have a real dearth of creativity, because I remember hearing that when sat-navs first came out, we went from using maps for everything and having to think about where we are in the relative location. Whatever part of the brain that is, I'm forgetting now, it's the prefrontal cortex or the hippocampus or something.
Yeah.
They have, in that 20 or 30 years since, they have shrunk because people have stopped having to navigate themselves. So the part of the brain that tells us exactly where we are, that helps us understand where we are relationally to wherever and like read the signs, and that's physically shrunk in most people. And to me, now I don't think most of us care that much practically, because I think we'd still prefer to have sat-nav, but ChatGPT is going to do that to our brain times what? Times 100, times 1,000? We don't know, because it's removing, I haven't had to do any thinking. So even using a search engine, I have to find something and put it into something. And I mean, when I was in school, if I just copy and pasted something I found online, my teacher would be able to find out and I'd get a worse mark because I wasn't thinking about what I was doing. And it makes sense because I wasn't actually able to say that back over. I'm hearing testimonials from teachers going, I've developed over 20 years this whole system, this method of teaching and learning that is to do with asking hard questions and cognitive performance and getting you to question everything. And children now, it's just like that's blown out of the water and they don't know how to do this, to think on their own 2 feet. And it's only been a couple of years. And it's a concern that I have. I'm wondering how much is this going to affect creativity, but also how much is this going to affect our emotionality, our fear, our intuition, our logical reasoning, our ability to communicate. What do you think the biggest risks are?
Yeah, that's so interesting because I think in some ways it will affect our ability to communicate and like intuition. Because if you're kind of, I think with like ChatGPT and LLMs, like I think it can be really useful for helping to expand on your like the idea. So if you're starting yourself and you're starting to be like, okay, how do I do this, and then assist it and assist in that way. But yeah, if you're like outsourcing your ability to think critically or like to come up with like ideas on something, then I think it is definitely going to impair how people function. I mean, it could mean that we are like, I think one of the effects of it, I think, is that it can maybe increase disengagement, as screen time often does, because like, but I think this sort of transferal of being able to sort of like write something, take that knowledge and then just put it somewhere without necessarily having to like be really cognizant of like what it is you're like really grappling with. That is, I think, a bit of a worry because it might just increase disengagement and things. And we know that screen time can do that anyway. I mean, that's like, yeah. That's
How so?
what screen time? Yeah, well.
Is there like a correlation, like the higher your screen time, the higher or lower something else?
I mean, social media and screen times have been shown to be like really impactful for young people's levels of anxiety and depression. There's work from, I don't know if the researcher Jonathan Haidt, he's a social psychologist, and his work has been prolific. He has a book called The Anxious Generation, and his work's been really prolific in showing that like at the time that social media started like permeating for like young people, teenagers around 2012, since then, there's been a steady increase in rates of anxiety and depression in young people.
I mean, these things, they give us this like steady drip of dopamine that never switches off.
Yeah.
Why? I know that's really detrimental, but I don't think I fully understand why. Like, I feel like our brains weren't programmed to have that constant dopamine, that constant stimulus, but every scroll on TikTok or Instagram gives us a little hit for some reason. What is so insidious? Like, it's like a quiet insidiousness. What is so insidious about the impact on the brain of using these things as often as we seem to be using them on average?
Yeah, so dopamine is a precursor to effort. So it's released when your brain and body calculate that effort is required for an output. But what we're seeing with things like social media, what it does is it down-regulates your dopamine receptors. And so it's like the analogy, now I've heard the analogy of it being like a slot machine. Like you're constantly like picking, like, what's it called? Like doing the lever on the slot machine. And what it does is it kind of like, it numbs the receptors in some ways. And that can lead to disengagement and lack of motivation.
You say it down-regulates them. What does down-regulates mean?
So it just decreases the strength of connectivity.
Why? Because it's so easy to get? Because we're not putting in real effort? Or
yeah, it's because you're not really expending a huge amount of effort for the return that you're getting.
Okay.
And the things that give you huge amounts of dopamine are things that are like quite like in good ways, like things that are quite replenishing. So it goes show like when you put in a huge amount of effort to do something, like whether you've been working at something for weeks and months, it feels great afterwards because you're like, that's like something I worked really hard to do. Whereas like with the steady sort of like increase in the way in which notifications are just popping up all the time, that is like hitting your dopamine receptors, but in many ways, numbing them.
That's really interesting. Because usually in the rest of nature, you use it or you lose it. So the more you use it, the stronger it gets. But in this case, the more that these pathways get used, the weaker they seem to get.
Well, it's a use it or lose it, but because the thing is that you're not using it as much. If you get like, it's like with you're not using your
Quality versus quantity.
yeah, sort of. We live in like a world that's of immediacy. Like, things are so accessible. Like you can, just go on your phone, you get food delivered, you can have your social needs like largely met online. I mean, I don't suggest that's a good way to go because like in-person social connection is hugely important. But there's just so many things that are so accessible, and we're so used to things being made immediate, like online. Like you get someone's like waiting for things to load feels really annoying. Whereas that's like, and the thing is that like a lot of the things that would benefit our survival, like when we're in evolution, things like finding food, those kinds of like connection, it benefits from effort. Like the effort you put in is like replenishing, whereas like we don't necessarily have to put as much effort in to get as much return, which means that it's sort of somewhat inexpensive and we don't attach as much value to these experiences. Things like, connecting. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that if this is impacting our, not just our creativity, but also our intuition, that there's an adverse effect on our like base or most fundamental survival instincts? So I would describe creativity, intuition, and synonyms to these words as like creation states, right? But to be in a creation state, you need to go beyond survival. So when you're living in survival mode of reactivity, a place of reactivity, what are the survival states? Well, fear is probably the biggest one, right? So if our brain is also finding it more challenging to be in a place of creation, then it's probably finding it easier to be in a place of survival, which is probably not a good thing, but is the way it is. So I'm wondering if fear is almost more common, stronger, easier for the brain to access, happening more often when you go down this rabbit hole far enough.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point because I think like safety is hugely important to the human body. Like, and we, in many ways, we crave feeling safe and psychologically safe. But the thing about the modern world is like there's been an increase in chronic stress. And we have a lot of things about modern life, like whether it's going online and like that we're able to that increase levels of stress within the body. And that can make people operate from a more hypervigilant state, which, as you say, is not as beneficial for creativity. Because if you're wanting to come up with free-flowing ideas, you need to be in a relaxed and like more, I don't know, sometimes it can propel creativity because you're forced into like to find solutions. But I think fear it can impact creativity. I mean, it definitely relates to this, like, I think that like with the human brain and body, there's sort of a juxtaposition between the two fundamental needs and survival needs or things that we want to feel safe, to feel like, and that like, I mean, you think about it on it's not necessarily feeling safe as in like, I think something's gonna come around the corner and kill me, but it's more so that in nervous system regulation. So like, say if you're in an environment, like a workplace or something where people are aggravated, then that might increase the level of your like sympathetic nervous system, your body's like, stress, like what's called freeze flight response. And it can make you feel a bit stressed. And that can impair your ability to feel safe. But yeah, we have this juxtaposition between like wanting to be safe, wanting to feel like, comforted in the environment, but also wanting to like innovate and finding this adaptive edge that means that like, in evolutionary sense, it's inherently wanting to survive is wanting to sort of like be able to adapt better. And in the modern day setting, that is like, you see it with people and companies wanting to innovate and like, and wanting to do things in a new, more efficient kind of way. But that kind of push and pull, I think, can make people feel conflicted. And I know I've often thought of it as like the crux of anxiety, but that's more anecdotal than anything else.
Okay,
But
talk to me about that. What is that? What is at the crux of the anxiety epidemic that we've got going on?
well,
That's not a good word for it, but
yeah, well, anxiety is often comes from a fear of a future outcome. So when we're feeling anxious, what we might do is try and predict the kinds of outcomes, all the possible outcomes that might happen, and interestingly, it was Jean-Paul Sartre basically said that the difference between fear and anxiety is that fear is something that like is outside of you, whereas anxiety is more fear of your own capabilities. That is, which is an interesting viewpoint on that. But I think anxiety often comes from wanting to feel safe, but also, maybe wanting to kind of push yourself as well. In certain contexts, I think like an anxiety can come from a lot of different areas, like in life and in relationships.
There's physical safety, there's also psychological safety, right? I think physical safety we understand really well, at least because it seems so obvious to us. We're a very visual-based society. It's very easy for us to see, oh, there's no bear, there's no car that's going to run you over, whatever. Psychological safety is something most of us aren't proactive about, we're reactive towards because of. What would your tips for improved psychological safety be, or how do we improve our psychological safety so we can be in that place of creation and tap into that improved brain? I'm now building this improved brain because I know how to work on these 3 areas of my brain thanks to you, but I can't access it because I've got all this psychological unsafety or fear. How do I become or feel more safe?
Yeah, I mean, psychological safety we often talk about in terms of like an environment, in workplaces, psychological safety is really important. And what contributes to that environment or like to feeling psychologically safe is nervous system regulation. So you can't feel very safe or like when your body is dysregulated, when your brain and body are like, okay, I need to feel safe. And so being able to regulate yourself, whether that's through doing things like mindfulness, breath work, that can help to put you into a state that means you're more relaxed, more calm, more better prepared to think of things in a more open and more expansive way than shutting down. Or even things like therapy is part of the reason that psychotherapy is really important is because I guess what you're doing in therapy is what it can help you to do is look back and think about the kinds of strategies that you developed as a child to make yourself feel safe within your surroundings. And then you can reflect on that and say, that was a really clever thing to do as a child, to like have these strategies to make yourself feel safe. But in adult life, you don't necessarily need those anymore. So you can really help to kind of maybe create a bit of a distance between yourself and your emotion, how your emotion relates to the experience.
What if I'm really annoyed at myself though? Because that was a really stupid response when I was doing that as a child.
I don't think coming across annoyed is a very helpful way to address it. I think you need to have compassion for yourself. And also, I think recognizing that like your children are so smart in their ways of like coming up with strategies. We learn so much in the first few years of our life. But these things can sometimes imprint on you and kind of like your brain can use them as defaults to kind of to make yourself feel safe in future. And that can come up through like dysregulated kinds of behaviors. Like say, for example, like losing your temper or like someone criticizes you on something that's kind of minor and then you're like, whoa, these are the kinds of things that like, and then someone else will be like, oh, that's a bit odd, I don't know why I overreacted to that, but it could relate to something further in your past that has kind of put a default in your brain to like, that it feels like unsafe in those situations.
When you say a dysregulated behavior, what is a regulated and a dysregulated?
Yeah, maybe dysregulated behavior isn't the point because it's more like emotional regulation, dysregulation. Rather, it's the behaviors that come out of feeling dysregulated.
Okay, so we're talking about the root then. So what is a regulated system?
A regulated system. So I think a regulated nervous system is it's one where you feel relaxed and safe within the environment and able to deal with uncertainty and risk. The flexibility to be able to adapt to situations or not catastrophize if something seems to go a bit wrong and sort of create that kind of space for things to maybe feel a bit uncertain and to be flexible about how you respond to it is super important. And I think being emotionally regular, I mean, we're all emotionally dysregulated at some stage. No one is perfect. Like, we all have moments of things that like, if you feel stressed or it's part of being human. But working on strategies are like ways to help yourself feel more regulated on a regular basis. But that's also related to your environment. I mean, your environment is so important in how it shapes you.
And you mentioned mindfulness, a bit of breathing. What is the fastest way to get us back into or to re-regulate our nervous system when we're in a moment of challenge? What do you recommend? What do you do yourself? What do you see that works that's quick and easy? Because we live in a dopamine-filled society where I need everything to be quick and easy.
Yeah, well, I think if you're talking about emotional regulation on a whole, I don't know if I don't think there is necessarily like a quick fix, because a lot of these strategies are developed from, like, say, childhood, and it's not something that like you can kind of just switch off or switch on. But I think if you're in a state of high stress and you're like, okay, right, and things like breath work is super important. I mean, it's so unbelievable how breathing can really help to reset your nervous system. And finding a space of quiet where your senses aren't overloaded with the environment can be super important. And so I think those are the two things that I would suggest if you're feeling in a state of high stress: breathing and doing things that might make yourself feel safe. Think about situations where things have gone really well, and like things have, like, and you do really well, and like often we can, I don't know, feel anxious about possible outcomes. But if you think of a similar situation in the past where actually it has gone quite well for you, and you've then that would be really helpful as well, because it's sort of like helping to shift your mindset from one that's like maybe in a sense of like scarcity and like, okay, I need to protect myself. I need to kind of, because that's really what's happening when you feel stressed, and when you feel like that's like, it's a need for your body to be like, I need to protect myself right now. And being able to kind of move yourself into a mindset from, yeah, we talk about, like, I mean, there's a theory, but from scarcity to abundance. And scarcity, I guess, is the feeling that like there aren't enough resources for people to go around, and so I need to take what I can, and I need to make sure I'm protected. But if you're able to move yourself into a state of mind where you're like, actually, yeah, I can, I don't have to feel that kind of sense of control. I can sort of allow myself to let go a bit. That can really help to feel more relaxed in the situation.
When I'm working with someone on this exact thing, what I'll usually say, like, the easiest thing to learn to do is, like, let's say you're at a conference, or you're at a work event of some kind. It's noisy, you've been there all day, you're tired, we have another 2 hours you need to go. There's probably a quiet-ish corner somewhere that you can go, maybe put in some white noise in your ears to your earphones if you need to, or whatever. Close your eyes and do really deep breaths in, fully in, hold it for a few seconds, and then fully out, ideally through the mouth. Because when you audibly go through the mouth, you kind of like, it lets something go, like it seems to shake something out of your nervous system. And just 60 seconds of that, I don't know the studies the way you do, but I know that there are studies, so citation needed, about just how powerful that can be and just how quickly it can do that. And that is, I think, the easiest way of incorporating both breath and some kind of mindful activity that anyone can do at any time. You don't need to be a master of anything. Thoughts might still come in, but it's just about like shaking off something, like you're shaking off some cobwebs or something from your body.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there you go. That's exactly the kind of strategy that would be great to like regulate, exactly to regulate yourself. Yeah, that kind of freedom.
What's your story? Why did you get into all this stuff that you're doing? Why do you care so much about the brain? What's your background?
Sure. So my background is I originally started studying philosophy, and I was very fascinated by the idea of consciousness. And this is when I was like 15 or so, I suppose. But I was really fascinated by, we have these things in our heads, these squishy things in our heads that are made up of matter, similar to molecules and particles like everything else in the world. And yet because they're comprised in this way, we have the ability to have feelings and thoughts and to kind of relate to people and feel emotions and feel like, and have this kind of aboutness, this we call intentionality in philosophy, to think about things, about the world. And I was like really fascinated by that for a long time. Now understanding more about like the evolutionary mechanisms behind consciousness. I mean, consciousness is still a huge question. Like,
It's a big gray area.
Yeah, but that was really where it started. So my background was in philosophy, and then I studied philosophy of mind, neurophilosophy, philosophy of aesthetics. And I was working in creative industries for a while, and my interest in like creativity and why, like, you see the artists or like musicians that create these amazing works, and I was like, what is going on in the brain that really steers people to be able to do that? And that was really my interest in studying the neuroscience creativity. So I did a master's at Goldsmiths in neuroaesthetics. and creativity. And that kind of steered my interest in how the sensory environment impacts the brain. But I don't know, to answer your question, I've always been fascinated by the brain because it's the seat of the self. I've always been interested by people and like how people connect with each other, how someone's background, their past, like their whole life's experience makes them who they are today. And that starts with the brain. I mean, your brain quite literally creates your reality. So that's like, it's always been a fascination for me. And I loved people like Oliver Sacks, who read his work for years, and yeah.
So if, philosophically, if I put a Neuralink chip in my brain, am I still the consciousness that I am? Am I part machine now? To what extent is the brain just this important, or what's most important about us? And the reason I ask is because for you to be so interested in consciousness at such a young age, I mean, 15 years old, I wasn't interested in consciousness until I was 20 or 21, which also to a lot of people also sounds young. So you're even younger than that. And it's an interesting question, like, what is consciousness and where is the seat of our consciousness? Because some say it's not the brain, it's the heart. And all kinds of things. Or is it the gut? Then where does intuition come in and all these things? So, I mean, the brain is fascinating, but we don't just have neurons in the brain. We've also got them in the heart and in the gut. And arguably the nervous system is an extension or a connection of all three of those. And that's in itself one big neurological structure. So, I mean, what's your perspective on the importance of the brain and the importance of other parts of our body, and where is consciousness?
So consciousness, I think, evolved as a kind of awareness, like that what your body needs, how it relates to the world, and how we relate to others. And I think you're right. I mean, it does, like, your whole, part of the reason why when you're looking at things like psychological well-being, it's so important to not just look at the brain, but look at the whole body and have a holistic approach, is because as you say, it feeds all the kinds of the feelings of like awareness and like and how we feel within a given environment. In terms of my understanding or take on consciousness, I often see consciousness and like your brain activity as like two sides of a coin. There's a lot of debate in philosophy around how do we have consciousness? Does it come out of the brain? Does it reduce into the brain? And there's very sort of tricky territory around emergentism. That's one. That's something that philosophers don't like to go in too far in there, I think, because it sort of presupposes that your thoughts are something that exists kind of esoterically.
And what philosophers tried to like avoid that?
Well, if you're a materialist and you believe that like everything in the world is composed of matter, and then to say that we have these things that are somewhat coming out of the brain, it's to somewhat presuppose that exist in
the existence of something beyond matter. That scares some people.
Yeah, so the kind of there are still people that do believe that, and there's definitely there's people who hold all different kinds of views, but materialism and the idea that these thoughts and stuff like that reduced into the brain is generally considered. But I don't know if that's really a very helpful way to look at it, because like reduction presupposes that you can't really reduce two things unless they're made somewhat of the same thing. Whereas like when we talk about brain states and mental states, they're not really composed of similar, like the same thing.
Really? Okay, how do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, there's a philosopher called Gilbert Ryle who talks about category mistakes. And he was like, the thing is, without relating brain states and mental states, or trying to reduce one and trying to, is that they're just, they exist in different categories. And so you're kind of like, it's very hard to do, because it's like, you're kind of presupposing that something fits into another. And so when I like to think about it, is like, yes, we have like, these neural connections that are happening, and we have thoughts that are like, align with them and that, but they're happening simultaneously in two sides of the same coin. It's not like one is coming out of the other. It's like, that's kind of my take on it. Although, you can ask many philosophers' mind, like all neuroscientists, who will have very different kinds of takes, but that's sort of how I think.
That's interesting, because you would assume that your mental state is your brain state, but they're two different things. And when you say reductionism says that you can't reduce two different things, break this down for me practically. What does this mean? So our state of mind can exist separate from our state of brain?
No, I don't think so.
So what are these two things that exist separately of each other?
I wouldn't say they exist, because I think when you get into existentialism, that's tricky territory. Because because if you were saying something exists, that has connotations to it being existing in matter and things
Physical.
like that.
Okay, fine.
But this is why I think you're right. I don't think they are. Like, I think on one level they are somewhat inseparable, but I think it's more in terms of like explanatory power. Like, it's you could say that like the mental states reduce into brain states, so there's no point in talking about mental states. But like, we're still going to say it's still going to be more useful for someone to tell you how they feel rather than say like, my amygdala is really, really activated right now. Like, what are you gonna like? That's not if you're feeling anxious or like it's like that's a bit of a crass example, but like the explanatory power that we have with mental state, because it creates such a richness to life, and that's also just how we think and how we talk and how we relate to people. But yeah, and it's like, currently, I mean, God knows with Neuralink, maybe, but at the moment, like a neuroscientist can look at a brain scan and tell someone like, oh, I didn't know this is exactly what you were thinking. You can see sort of areas of connectivity that, and extrapolate or like infer things that like are, areas that have been activated, but you can't read someone's thoughts. And that's always something that in consumer neuroscience, for example, is a bit of a dangerous route to go down. If you have like a neuromarketing company that's like claiming to read people's brain, read their mind, that's a bit of a,
Yes.
so you should be a bit wary of that.
I've seen demonstrations of tech that can read a mind using AI attached to some device that's like scanning your brain, but it has to be trained on your brain.
Interesting.
So everyone's brain's wired a little differently. So it can read your mind only if you, and I don't know how they do this, you somehow train this AI model on your specific brain. And one of the things that is interesting to me is this sounds like it's impossible to do without me moving physically, like going physically into some kind of study or something where a tech company of some kind reads my brain somehow and then I sign up, I consent to it. But actually, Apple updated their patents for the AirPods like a couple of years ago. It wasn't like super recent. That allowed them, because the Bluetooth waves go through your brain on any wireless device. So I still have wired headphones because I don't like that. Bluetooth going through your brain isn't supposed to be very good for you. But let's say you've got two AirPods, they're two distinct things. They both connect to the phone to receive, but they also connect to each other through your brain. And Apple updated the patent on the AirPod so that they could read the brain waves through the AirPods. So the AirPods could pick up your brain signals, and they could almost presumably use that data to reverse engineer how your brain is working, and then almost maybe even train AI on that to start reading every individual's brain. So in other words, theoretically, with the right tech and the right T's and C's ticked, you could actually gather data on the brain of anyone who's using that device and then train an AI, and then that could somehow turn into mind reading. This has become a bit of a tangent, but the reason I say this is because everyone's brain's a little bit different. And what this means is we have to understand our brain, but it's still understandable to other people. In other words, the brain is still like the supercomputer. It's just that we all have a slightly differently wired supercomputer.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I'd be curious to know how that happens, because my intuition would be that in order for an AI to learn everything that's going in your brain, it would need to somehow have access to all of the past experiences that you've ever had. Which I don't know. I don't know if how that. I mean, I'm sure it is possible. I'm sure with Neuralink, there's many things that you can do.
It would need to access your past experiences to be able to understand the why. But if all it needs to know is right now, a bear scares me and a lion doesn't, or whatever, then all it needs to do is understand I've looked at a bear and my amygdala is flared up or whatever, right? Relevant part of the brain. Have I got that right? I don't know. Anyway, that's all it needs to know, right? And then it's flared up, and here's the neural pathway to another part of my brain that's led to a memory. It now knows, okay, I've been attacked by a bear before. It doesn't need to know why or when.
Yeah.
to know if all it wants to do is understand how I'm going to respond.
Yeah, I'm sure it could predict your responses, and especially in a situation like that. I was like, very, very well.
Very rudimentary example.
Are you sure? Yeah. I mean, I slightly worry what that might do to people. I feel like everyone has the right to have their own inner mental life. I think if there was transparency between what people are thinking and everyone and other people around, then like can you imagine if your thoughts, you had to be paranoid that your thoughts were going to be heard or like understood by someone else? It would drive people crazy. I mean, it's like, everyone deserves to have their own inner mental life. And I think that kind of scares me, but like, there's a lot of things about AI and Neuralink in the future that are scary. So
No, I agree, and it's a privacy piece we haven't had to worry about before, right?
Yeah.
Cybersecurity, but like for your brain or something.
Yeah.
It is challenging. The reason I like to think about this is because I like to think about some keywords. So there's some keywords as we start to end off that I'd like us to understand and define a little more and see how we can practically bring them into our lives. The first one is neuroplasticity. So this is, I think, maybe the most used one in like the zeitgeist around neuroscience and anything to do with the brain. I use it a lot in my hypnosis, NLP work, but it's the fundamental of any learning is neuroplasticity. So walk us briefly through neuroplasticity and how I can prove how neuroplastic my brain is.
How you can prove how neuroplastic your brain is. Okay. Yeah,
Improve.
Improve, yes. So neuroplasticity is the ability of your brain to form new neural connections that are hardwired, that are really underlie the basis for us to learn new things. And it's the ability of your brain to build up resilience and to acquire cognitive reserve, which can then be used to keep create strength connections. And it's like neuroprotective against things like Alzheimer's, memory decline. And neuroplasticity is really the ability, as I say, for your brain to grow and to really be able to it's how we learn. And for a long time, it was believed that when you reach the age of 25, the brain stops growing. You're done, you're not learning.
Yes.
It stops changing, sorry, not growing. But we now know from the last 70 years of research that that your brain is plastic. So even though it slows down, like learning to slow down as you get older, and the ability for your brain to sort of take over other areas of that are perhaps inactive, we know that's possible in things like stroke examples or victim, sorry. And it's the ability for your brain to sort of regrow, regenerate, and it's the crux of learning and be able to learn new things.
Okay. And then there's a word you've used a few times, neuroprotective. This sounds obvious, protecting our brain. What does it really mean?
Yeah, so neuroprotective is, I guess when you say an activity or anything you can do that maintains the ability of your brain. It was often referred to in terms of memory. Things that are neuroprotective against Alzheimer's and memory decline as we get older are things that help to increase neuroplasticity of your brain. There's basic things like exercise, nutrition, having diversity in your diet and stuff like that. Learning new things is super important, keeping your brain engaged in that sense, as we spoke about. Learning an instrument or learning a new language are often examples that you
can ask what kind of things? Does it have to be a physical thing or language has so many nuances that it means learning quite a lot. You're not just learning formula.
Yeah.
Instruments, similar, because you're using so many of your senses. So I can understand why those examples are used, but are these the only examples? Or can I learn anything?
No, I think what's specific about those examples, as you said, it's that adaptability. It's the ability to learn something and take that and reframe it and use it in different ways, as we do with language, as we do with learning an instrument. And that's kind of what is the basis for hardwiring in your brain, which creates that neuroplastic change. It's something that, it's hard to describe because it's something that really engages your brain. For a long time, people were crosswords help you to keep your brain sharp. Nowadays, it's brilliant to do crosswords, but that's not necessarily the only thing that will help you. I don't know, you need to be very mentally engaged in what you're doing and learning new things. And if we go back to talking about how we spoke about AI and what LLMs are doing to knowledge retention, I think, then that is, it's a bit of a worry in some senses.
Do you know what? This is a good point what I was going to ask is, how do we know whether the thing I'm doing is good enough or not? But I think it's the difference between I got something out of ChatGPT or I put in a big chunk of effort and after a week I saw a payoff. We know what that feeling is like. It's like a sort of elation from doing a really hard thing as opposed to just getting results suddenly.
Yep.
We know what it feels like to do the intense exercise routine, be done, be like, oh, I'm done. You know, these, for whatever that is for you, because that, you know, learning an instrument might not be that for me, but
Yeah.
something else might be. Maybe the best way to become a better learner and therefore improve our neuroplasticity and our neuroprotectedness is to get to know ourselves better. And what gives us that fulfilling, I don't know how to describe this, like it's like a sense of fulfillment that's kind of dopamine, or no, it is dopamine, but it's a stronger thing. It's not this little tiny hit, it's the big effort reward system you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. And like learning things, like we know that like learning like from intrinsic desire tends to be more hardwired, which makes sense because if you're interested in something, you're gonna like you remember it better. But yeah, and it's also that ability to like, I mean, you talk about how to improve that plasticity. It's like test yourself. Like if you learn something, can you talk about it a week later? Can you like an instrument? Can you play that thing a week later? Like without like, and it's just like testing the like capability. Like, do you have the capability from what you learned to action it? What do we say? We're talking about that purpose-driven kind of aspect. Yeah, and purpose is hugely important when we think about things like stress. So you have things like, we call it like good stress and bad stress, eustress and distress. And stress that is intrinsically like motivated by something you like desire and want to learn more about and want to better yourself, that's aligned with your values, can actually be really beneficial for your brain and for memory. Whereas when it's distress or stress that's been put on you, that I mean, everyone has stress in their life. From you can't always do exactly what you want to do. I mean, that's kind of life. But when there's like you have a lot of stress over a long period of time of stuff that's put on you, that is not related to like your values or things that make you feel valued, and then that can create chronic stress and be hugely impairing for things like memory. Which is interesting because like, stress that's geared by I mean, cortisol is essential for functioning, it's essential for living, but we have an epidemic of chronic stress at the moment. But when like that cortisol is fueled but into things that you are intrinsically motivated by, purpose-driven, value-aligned, then it helps to increase memory, like your memory capability.
When you say intrinsically motivated, you mean like not because I have to pay my bills at the end of the month or because there's a gun held to my head, but because I just want to genuinely for me.
Yeah, and of course that's a bit of a utopia in which you can always do those things, and you have to, you need to earn money, you've got to have, but it's, that's why I think that things like job crafting can be really important, because like you obviously are there to serve a company and they will pay you for, but like if you're able to navigate that in a way where you can, and for leaders and for managers, if you can tap into what people are motivated by, what they're driven by, what their passions are, what their interests are, and use that to feel like them and the company, they will feel more valued and more kind of like, and more engaged, I think, because like, where we said earlier, peak salience. Like the things that you're interested by are the things that are salient to you, and you're more likely to learn something. It's more likely to be imprint, like to be kind of like wired into you if you're like really, if it aligns with your values, and it relates to your feeling of purpose and then what you want to achieve in your life.
Your whole thing, that's a total lie, but the thing you love the most, as far as I know, is neuroaesthetics. So this is my final word I want us to define right now. And then we're going to construct this and put this together. But what is this thing called neuroaesthetics? Because I know, like, if I look aesthetic today, or my room is aesthetic, right? And I know, okay, well, the brain. So in my head, I'm like, okay, neuroaesthetics is the brain liking the thing because it's aesthetic, but that's probably really wrong. So what is it?
Yeah, so neuroaesthetics is a subdiscipline of neuroscience, which studies how beauty and aesthetics in your environment and how the sensory experiences change your brain and your body and your behavior and impact and benefit well-being.
It's like feng shui.
Feng shui. I guess you could talk about like how you to shape your environment, how to design your environment. But yeah, it's really about how aesthetics and the environment and rich sensory experiences. And that doesn't necessarily have to be within art. I mean, art, music, dance are hugely, those are aesthetic experiences, hugely impactful on the brain. But also in terms of your sensory environment, how are you designing your environment that feeds your brain in such a way that is like replenishing, engaging, enriching, and but also like somewhat calming or good, makes you feel calm in your environment. I mean, I suppose it depends on what you're trying to get from the environment. But if it's a home space or a workspace, you're going to want to probably make people feel quite calm, like quite sort of an ability to focus and feel relaxed.
What are some of the biggest examples of things I can aesthetically change about my environment to create some of the most desired neurological states? So I'm thinking, you just mentioned a relaxing home, for example. I'm assuming a lot of your work looks at the workplace, how we can improve workplace aesthetics, environments, furniture, wallpaper, all the things. What are some of the biggest shifts, or even the smallest shifts, that can have the biggest impact in creating some of those desired states we talked about at the beginning?
Yeah, so I'll talk about three things. I think firstly, one of the most important things is light exposure, because light is hugely impactful on your body, of your ability to, like your circadian activity, so it impacts sleep, but also really has a huge effect on your ability to concentrate, your ability to feel engaged. So light is hugely important, whether it's a home space or whether it's a workspace. That's like having access to huge amounts of natural light is hugely important. Secondly, biophilic design. So incorporating aspects from nature and from the natural environment is really beneficial, and partly because we evolved to live in nature for around more than 99% of the time that our species has been on this planet. So things like having natural woods, having natural materials, plants are really replenishing and can help to make you feel relaxed and calm within the environment. Thirdly, I want to talk about something to help enrich the environment. And we spend a lot of time talking about creativity. And the thing I want to talk about is this idea of fractal imagery. So fractals are repetitions of self-similar patterns, but we see this all around nature. You see it on leaves, you see it on trees, and you see it in artworks, a lot in like patterns. And what that does is it creates a lot of salience within the brain, because it sort of peaks those the balance between novelty and familiarity, I think, is the two main things. And that's something that I think an environment is really important to strike, to have something that is enriching, that kind of makes you feel like inspired, but also a certain amount of familiarity to make people feel calm and relaxed.
If we live a life that is highly neuroprotective, and we create an environment that improves through neuroaesthetics, improves our brains, and we understand, believe, and work on our neuroplasticity, I'm wondering if that is like the golden combination that allows us to work on these three areas of the brain that we talked about at the beginning and improve their pathways, and therefore improve our outcomes, because the creativity helps us with an outcome. It makes us feel good. It's also very practical. It helps us with outcomes.
Yeah, and creativity helps to, it's sort of like helps to lay the groundwork for increasing plasticity, or that resilience of your brain to adaptability to change.
So it becomes a self-improving cycle.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, being creative is hugely brilliant. I mean, of course, there's an aspect of neuroplasticity that is, it's hardwiring. So you need to kind of, for any creative experiences, hardwire those. But I mean, I think interestingly enough, increasing neuroplasticity is neuroprotective. So because it's creating, it's building cognitive reserve, this resilience and this adaptability of your brain to change and to new environments that can keep you sharper, I guess, keeping more
This is really important, because I think about, this is a self-improving cycle. We can also get into self-deprecating cycles. And you're either caught in a cycle of constant self-improvement or you're caught in a cycle of constant self-destruction. And the cycle can only be broken from within. So if you recognize that you're damaging your brain instead of helping it, that needs to stop. And then you can start putting in some of these things. But if you're constantly on social media every day, putting a few plants in your house might not help very much.
Exactly, and that's true, and that's almost like the dark side of neuroplasticity, is that you can wire or hardwire negative thought patterns and thought associations, which is why self-talk and the way in which we talk to ourselves or think about ourselves is so important. Because yeah, I mean, hardwiring is really like reinforcing those pathways. And so yeah, as you say, if you're doom scrolling for like an hour or two a day, that's going to be hardwiring a different kind of activity or like tendency. And that's why it's important with like apps to really be really vigilant and like aware of when like the content is engaging you and when you're just like passively going on and scrolling. And we all do it, but also just like even steering your algorithms to be like, what do you want to learn? What do you want to learn about? Or do you, I mean, like, because there's so much stuff on social media that like it can be anxiety inducing. And also because things that can make us feel anxious can also, we might be like more incentivized to watch them. But I think being aware with your algorithms or like what it is who you're following and like content that's just, yeah, like, is it helping to learn or is it sort of, I mean, yeah, I mean, social media can be a huge, amazing platform for learning as well. It like, which is, but it is just, yeah, being vigilant about like how much time because it's that kind of like passive versus active engagement. If you're kind of passively there, just like letting things kind of whereas beforehand, I think what we had before, like we had social media, you had to, if you want to learn, you had to be quite like active and like going out to learn about something or conversing with people. Whereas like with social media, it's a little different.
We don't have to try, again, another place we don't have to try very hard. Sometimes it's easier to ask ChatGPT to give me a summary of a book than to go read the book. But actually, I find the book gives you better insights and you actually understand it a bit better.
Yeah, it's interesting.
We pattern this.
Yeah, it's interesting with that MIT study that I mentioned. The whole study is about 200 pages, but within it, they put in certain lines or something that like essentially made it so that, because a lot of people just put it in ChatGPT, but they did it to kind of trick the system so that when people just put it in ChatGPT, they put certain lines within the paper to make it like, yeah, like just to kind of make the point of being like using LLMs to do, like, as you say, like just a transfer of knowledge and stuff like that isn't always the best, but it is what people do. It's what, and it's only going to proliferate more. Because, people are always looking for the brain is constantly looking for shortcuts. If we can find a more efficient, easy way to do things, we will do it. But that's not always best serving even just feeling happy, like our ability to feel happy and feel like engaged and stuff like that.
It means we're going to have to work on doing the uncomfortable thing on purpose.
But will we?
Will we?
We'll have it in the dark.
I suppose we'll find out. Look, Saskia, this has been really cool. We've been able to understand not just more about how the brain works, but practically what things we need to do to leverage how that brain works and break the cycles we're getting ourselves into. So this has been really cool. I have a closing question I ask everyone who comes on the show. Okay. The show is called Lost in Searching. So I'd love to know for you, what is the number one question you are still searching for the answer to?
God, that is a good question. What's the number one question? I suppose, God, that's tricky. For me, it's really finding out how best to make the things that align with my purpose and what I care about, how can I create a life that's shaped around that? And that's really what I'm constantly searching for, I think, is like being able to join those two things together. And also just being able to, like, how can I best share stuff about neuroaesthetics and about the things that I'm interested in and convey them in a way that's accessible and useful for people and useful and kind of, so yeah, that's what I'd end with.
We've got over an hour of your brilliant knowledge on this podcast and you're trying to figure out how to apply it. The answer might be easier than you expect, but at the same time, you're out here doing things like this, so maybe you already got, some answer to this.
Well, I hope so. Time will tell.
Time will tell. Yeah, well, you don't hope so, you are, but time will tell exactly where it is.
Well, I hope so.
Stop saying I hope so. because it is happening. Because this has been really cool, and I really appreciated this. And I know when I'm speaking to someone who knows their stuff and is able to communicate it and is on a path to being able to really practically use it for people. And you've been caring about this for so long, which is why I find, the question of like, what is consciousness? When you're like 15, that's mind blowing. Most of us never, a lot of people never think about it. So you're on a really incredible path, and thank you for sharing it with us today. It's been really cool.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's been such an interesting conversation, and I've really loved delving into these topics.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Well, look at you making it to the end of the episode. Welcome. There's a lot more for you to do. If you're still here, there's a full playlist on YouTube down below. There's a recommended video probably somewhere around the screen or down below, and so much more. Give us a follow, help share if you're here. Hey, maybe you enjoyed it. And look, this show only grows with your help. So again, I know you're probably bored of hearing it, but it would mean the world to me if you help us out and paid it forward and shared it around. And hey, you never know how this will help someone else. So thank you so much for being here, for being a part of it. Lots of love, and here's to your success. See you soon.